So, start with the basics. What's your name and what's your year and your degree? And then what's your slogan and your colour?
My name is Ronan. I'm studying arts law and I'm in my third year. My slogan is "You only live once" and I am running on pink.
Great.
And who is your campaign manager?
I have a core, or like a brains trust, of Tim Matthews, Michael Rees and James Higgins and Nicola Borton.
Okay, great. So, first kind of full question, are you aligned with a political party? And if not, how would you describe your political views?
Sure. I am not aligned with a political party. I consider myself a progressive candidate.
Okay. Is there a particular political party that you might say you are most closely aligned with?
Sure. I voted Labour in the last election.
Okay, great.
So let's follow on to that. Which of the other candidates, some of whom do have political allegiances, do you feel you share a political connection with?
Mm-hmm. I know that Cameron Kakamo doesn't have a political party that he's aligned with, but I feel like I agree with him on a lot of things. I also really respect Ed McMahon for his views on transparency as well as his general progressivism.
Okay, great. On the note about other candidates, who are you planning to preference first and second, and who will you be preferencing last?
Sure. My top two candidates are probably the two that I just said, Cameron Kakamo and Ed McMahon. My last would probably be Agir Gupta, but if he is not considered, given he's not campaigning this week anyway, probably Callum Forbes.
Okay.
And out of the two preferences you mentioned, what order will they be?
Sure, Cameron and then Edward.
Who will you vote for the president of the USU?
Assuming you get elected.
If
Yeah,
you
sure.
get elected.
At this point, I would like, I'd prefer to be approached by people that were wanting to put their name down for the president because, I'd like to see and hear about people's vision. That said, if I had to make a decision right now, I would vote for Tim Matthews.
Yeah, I guess that doesn't come as a surprise. Given that Tim is authorising and managing your campaign, do you think voters should assume that voting for you means voting for Tim Matthews?
No, I don't think so.
So there wouldn't be a problem with him running your campaign, managing your campaign, authorising your campaign, and then you not necessarily voting for him for president?
I don't think he's definitely running. Again, I need to be convinced.
Okay.
Okay. What's the most important USU program, in your opinion, and why is it important?
I think O-Week is a really important program. That said, I think it has its flaws, but I think it's really important in terms of engagement with the union, given that the bulk of access cards, for example, and are bought during O-Week. I think it's the biggest opportunity that the union has to, absorb people and engage people.
And when you say that it's got its flaws, what do you think that would be?
I think one of the main flaws of O-Week is the fact that they don't align the access card necessarily with being a membership to the union. So the access card is kind of painted as this separate tent that you kind of see is a hurdle to joining a club or joining a society. I think that the union needs to make itself and its brand known as something more cohesive and more than just an access card.
Okay.
And how would you make that connection more clear?
I think that would involve a rebranding of what access means, making just even on a simple note, making the University of Sydney Union logo bigger on it, and also including information pamphlets and things like that in what they hand out with an access card. And just they have so many volunteers at access tents that I don't think it's particularly hard to say this is your access to and membership to the union, and here's what else it offers other than just clubs and societies, for example.
Just another follow-up about O-Week. I would think that one of the flaws of O-Week is that it's quite short. It obviously engages a lot of students, but for students that are perhaps international students that haven't arrived by that date, or students that are coming in from overseas or coming in from holidays who, for whatever reason, don't make it to O-Week, do you think that it's detrimental that they don't have as easy an opportunity to engage with the union? Yeah,
absolutely. I think people that miss the train at O-Week are other people that fall off and just never have the impetus or the incentive to buy an access card. So I reckon that on the note of international students, for example, I think that's a little bit of a separate issue insofar as the union should be doing more to engage them and using its portfolios to engage them more. But I would be particularly supportive of a program that extended that kind of orientation process beyond, before week one of semester.
Okay.
Obviously, issues surrounding Tom Raue have been very at the forefront of the political debate at the uni. How would you have voted on Tom Raue's dismissal and why?
I wouldn't have voted to kick him off union board. The reason being, I don't think it is very easy to argue that he didn't break a duty as signed to in his director's statement. I believe that the duty that he primarily broke was being consistent with board policy, and that was that particular paper that he leaked a part of was confidential. Whether or not it should have been confidential is, I think, a different issue. That said, I think that the prevailing duty that I genuinely believe he, acted in alignment with was his fiduciary duty.
So I suppose that's interesting when you talked about your current presidential preference, being Tim Matthews, who obviously voted to expel Raue.
Yep.
How do you feel about that, and does that change your perception of him and whether he reflects your politics accurately?
I think I'm a kind of person that can work quite professionally and well with people that don't have views that, are my own. I think that the ways in which the board and the union perceives of directors' duties is often quite confusing and complex and often quite contradictory. I think the nature of how people perceive a fiduciary duty to be, as some people see it as being a duty to members and the board as one and the same, and people who view those two things as being often contradictory. I think that plays into how people would have voted on the motion, and I think that just kind of is indicative of the need for a discussion about how we view that duty in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you say that you're able to work professionally with people that you disagree with politically, I guess alluding to the fact that there would have been political disagreement if you and Tim had been on the board at the same time, him wanting to vote to remove Tom and you not. I guess it's not just a question of working with someone professionally, it's a question of potentially voting to elect that person as president.
Yep.
Also given the fact that the motion was put up by the executive of the union, minus obviously Tom, the vice president, who wouldn't vote to expel himself. I mean, do you think that it's not just a question of being able to work with Tim Matthews as someone who maybe has a political difference to you, but also about actually putting him potentially into a position of power or voting to reflect that you think that he has good political views?
Yeah, sure. I think the issue with Tom and that whole, situation, I would first of all hope that something like that didn't happen again. But that said, I would also hope that someone like Tim, and having had conversations with Tim, he also agrees that there needs to be things like conversations about how we look at directors' duties. And I would trust him, aside from the fact that we would have voted differently on one motion put forward by the board, I would trust him to engage in intelligent conversation and reach what he believed to be a good decision.
So we'll move on. Another question, how would you have voted on LifeChoice and why?
I would have voted it down, because I think that the union is meant to maximise its capacity to look after the well-being and the welfare and the happiness of its members. And I think that a society that, whilst it may have encompassed and supported the views of what I think was quite a small amount of people at the expense of the happiness and the welfare and the feeling of safety of a much larger group of people, I think that's the point at which you weigh up and say that it's not worth permitting.
So given that the board of directors, as I understand it, has the power to rescind the creation or the existence of a club or society, do you think that there is a need to have another vote on LifeChoice if there is, particularly if there was enough people on board like you who believe that it shouldn't have existed in the first place?
I'm sorry, I don't really understand the question.
Do you think that there should be another vote on whether LifeChoice should be allowed to exist, given that, as I understand it, it's not just about getting your application through in the first place. The board has the ability to withdraw that.
I would say yes.
Great. So next question. If you had to cut $1 million from the budget of the USU, where would you cut it from?
I think it's quite presumptive to be able to say that I could answer that question honestly and comprehensively now, because I think that there's a problem in the way that the union publicises its spending. It's enough that, I don't think it's enough rather, that the union publishes how much it spends and what assets, or the amount of assets that it has. I think that it needs to provide, and sooner, a more comprehensive breakdown of where that spending goes. I mean, if I had to give you an answer now, I imagine it would come from things like means testing, debating grants, looking at how we fund clubs and societies, look at where we inject money into various student programs, things like that.
So would something like, for example, salaries of people that work in the USU or stipends of board directors or of the executive board directors come into that spectrum at all? Or would you focus on, I guess, reducing some of the funding of the clubs and societies and programs?
I mean, again, because I haven't seen the exact spending, I couldn't say where you'd have to cut. I imagine you'd cut from everywhere. That said, I think that providing enough of an incentive to union staff is an important thing in terms of, assuring quality and dedication of the staff.
What role do you think the CEO of the USU currently plays, and what role would you like him to play?
Sure. I think at the moment Andrew is providing advice on things that are financial, things that are administrative, overseeing the functioning of the staff and things like that. I think that those are, first of all, in line with his constitutional roles, and second of all, I think that's the way it probably should be. I think that, and without particularly passing comment, I think that the CEO should always be answerable to the board and by extension answerable to the students.
And do you think that that's the current situation in terms of the interplay between the student elected board directors and people like the CEO and the Senate appointed directors? Do you think that there is a good balance of power, I guess, between them? Do you think that the current structure is that the students advise the CEO and the Senate appointed directors, or vice versa?
I think those are two quite separate issues, talking about the CEO and the Senate appointed directors. I don't believe that the Senate appointed directors should have a vote on the board. That said, I think that the CEO, in not possessing a vote, is kind of de facto answerable to the board and answerable to the students. And in having seen him in board meetings, he's very his consultation with the president and with the board, I think, is pretty sound.
And on the note about not thinking the Senate appointed director should have a vote, they obviously have been brought into the fold in the last year in terms of voting on the executive ballot. If you, in a year's time, if you're on the board, are running for an executive position, or if this year someone that you support has the support of the Senate appointed directors, would you speak out against the idea of using those votes to get elected onto the executive? Whether it was for you or for a candidate you supported?
Okay, sure. I, first of all, would not seek the vote of the Senate appointed directors, but before it even came to that position, I'd hopefully be involved in starting a conversation about how to remove that capacity. Obviously, constitutional change takes a fair amount of, pre-planning and things like that, but obviously something that I think is really worthwhile, and I think that involves informing students more about how to do things like change the constitution. I obviously can't really influence how people approach the Senate appointed directors for their own benefit or not. That said, if I were in a personal conversation, with someone like Tim or someone like Robbie or someone like Tara, I would say that I didn't think it was a great idea.
But you wouldn't necessarily publicly come out and say, I don't think that people should be seeking the vote of the Senate appointed directors, given that, as you say, constitutional change does take time and it's highly unlikely that that's going to happen before the next executive ballot.
Yeah, sure.
If those votes are sought, would you come out publicly, or would it only happen in the context of a personal conversation with the candidate?
I think in the context of the upcoming exec election, I don't think there is much of a point to be cynical and to be honest. If I was given, an opportunity to, sure, I'd probably agree to, say yes if I were asked the question in public. I'm saying it in public now to some extent. But next year I would definitely be involved in conversations that were more public, because they, I think, would be more productive.
Okay.
What's your opinion on the current policy achievements of the current board?
I think it's really difficult with things that take a lot of planning and a lot of kind of fundamental culture changes and policy changes in the way the union works to be able to slam someone or not for delivering on a policy within what is a relatively short amount of time for what are often quite sweeping changes. That said, I know that a lot of policies, are in the works and everything like that, and things that are happening at the moment, like Wentworth renovations, like home renovations, are making way for the board to be delivering on more policy changes. Policies that they ran on, last year and the year before that. That said, people, could probably try to be more expedient.
And do you think that there's a problem in terms of expediency with the actual structure of the union? Do you think that it's perhaps too bureaucratic or too hierarchical, or that there are barriers to getting things achieved within a 2-year term?
Sure. I mean, to be honest, I don't quite know. I mean, I'm not on board yet or ever will be. I think that it's really important that board directors do remember that they're not just going to be there to deliver their 5 or 6 or 15 things that they're promising. I mean, there are a lot of smaller hurdles that they need to get over, and I think that is, you know, par for the course, because that's how the union runs, that's how the union spends its like $22 million. Yeah.
Okay. So in particular, talking about policies and achievements of the current board, what do you think of Hannah Morris as the current president?
I think
or her presidency?
Sure. I think Hannah's presidency has been, to an extent, marred by what has been a significant amount of turbulence, and I think that the often very stressful circumstances that she's been put in have been really difficult, and would be difficult for anyone, to be honest, especially when they've got so many voices and so many different types of voices coming at them from every direction. Again, I suppose that's part of the role. That said, in terms of her style of presidency, I've always really respected her professionalism and her respect and her love for the union.
If you were to be put in similarly compromising positions, how would you react?
I think, what's an example of the situation?
Well, I mean, I guess when you talk about turbulence, Tom Raue is the most obvious example.
Yep.
I think it's also quite interesting, given that Hannah Morris was one of the original movers of the motion to remove Tom, so as much as it's her right to put up a motion, it was, I guess, a self-induced turbulence, not the court case, but the original motion. How do you think you would have responded to the kind of reaction that received?
If I were president?
If you, well, I guess if you as a board director had a difficult motion, or if there was like a large level of disagreement, how do you think that you could remain, I guess, professional in that situation?
Sure. I mean, everyone's different in how they deal with stress, right? But I imagine consultation with people that I know could create some level of cognitive dissonance, you know, and allow me to reach some sort of well-considered and balanced decision in my mind. You know, remaining calm is the most important thing in often what are very kind of twisted legal decisions or legalistic decisions that you may need to make. Yeah.
Okay. For the next question, do you support the current USU policy of not tweeting names of staff members during board meetings?
No, I don't agree with it.
Do you want to add on?
Sure. I think it's bizarre because, first of all, any member in what is, you know, a public meeting is able to attend and see the staff member who is speaking. It seems inconsistent that for some reason people can't broadcast that to people who, you know, may not have the time or the energy to be on campus.
What if they mischaracterise the opinions of a board director, and that's totally a potential with the nature of tweeting?
Sure.
Surely there's a risk there, and don't you think that's an issue?
Sure, I think that is an issue. I think that there is always plenty of time in things like being able to redirect people to minutes and, you know, correct things in, you know, meetings to follow up. Provides, you know, an opportunity for those particular staff members to, you know, correct them. That said, it means that board directors are also open to that same level of misrepresentation, and it's unclear to me why our elected representatives should be able to be misrepresented and not the people that they effectively hire through the CEO.
Do you believe the USU is a transparent organisation, and if not, how could it be more transparent?
Sure. I think it is semi-opaque. There are obviously things that the USU can do to be more transparent. I think things like publishing minutes, publishing them quicker, publishing things like arguments for and against, who voted for and against, and an ability for dissent to be published. I think that's also a really important thing. I think that also would have been really instrumental in changing the way that particularly controversial decisions in the past.
Okay, so kind of on the same note about transparency, when do you think board meetings should go in camera, and how do you think that contributes to the union's commitment to transparency?
Sure. I think that board meetings should go in camera when there is, you know, particular legal implications, like things like discussing defamation is really important, because on the topic of like misrepresentation, those can be particularly damaging things to be broadcast. I think that sensitive commercial operations should also be considered in camera, because at a point where like a contract or a tender might be being considered, I think those are things that for the for the benefit of the relationship between the union and those external service providers, it's really important for them to be able to be discussed in confidence.
So a lot of the candidates running this year have policies specifically directed at increasing transparency in the union. You don't. Is there a reason for that?
Sure. I think that, first of all, so many of the candidates, if not maybe like 7 or 6 out of 8 probably, are in support of transparency. I think it becomes a little bit of a moot point insofar as I think it is and probably will be a direction of the next board. I think that the policies that people run on should be more visionary insofar as they are about making decisions about specific ways to like spend the union's money, if that makes sense. I mean, I think there are loads of ways in which I as a candidate am able to talk about transparency and talk about my goals or my opinions on transparency, and that's when I'm talking to a particular voter or I'm talking in a lecture and things like that. I think that a policy statement is indicative of actual decisions you would make about implementing change beyond policy change.
I suppose the majority of students are only going to see those policy statements that you have though, so sure. Do you think it's important, or will you in the future make your issues on transparency and your political views more public?
Sure. First of all, on the idea that the students are, or most students are probably only going to see the policy statement, I don't think that's quite true. I think that more people are going to be open or seeing my campaigners or myself in person. I don't think many people actually read things like the candidate handbook as much as I think they may be really great as a tool for deciding who you want to vote for. So on that vein, I've had plenty of people in the first 3 days ask me about my opinion and my political views.
I suppose the nature of campaigners talking to students, though, it can only happen within a period of 30 seconds, sure. So it is quite brief, and I suppose it is often very cursory. So still, I asked the question, do you have any way in which you're going to make your issues on transparency more public? Yeah,
sure. I mean, in the last 3 days as well, I have spoken to people about my issues on my views on transparency, and often I find that people that are very interested in that kind of thing will actually ask, and that's a really great thing to be asked. In the public, and if I'm elected, I will obviously do as much as I can to engage in those conversations and to further those conversations and make them more public beyond being discussed on Twitter or in a board meeting. Yeah.
So the last question before we enter policy is, given that this year's pool of candidates only has 3 female identifying people running, and at least 2 of those must be elected to satisfy affirmative action, would you take a place on the board if you were elected solely on the basis of affirmative action?
Yes, I would.
And did you want to elaborate on that at all?
I think it's really important that's why affirmative action is in place, right? It's to make sure that until the point at which, a cultural change has occurred that it doesn't even need to be considered, then it should be in place. Like, there is a place for women on the board inherently, and it should be the case that, someone is filling that spot and able to represent those views.
And do you think that it's appropriate to have other forms of affirmative action on board, such as for queer identifying students, or for international students, or for students of ethnically diverse backgrounds?
Sure. As none of those, as I identify with none of those groups or none of those minorities, so I think I'd only be able to answer that question after, what is extensive consultation.
Okay. Yeah. All right, we'll move on to policy then.
So part of your policy is introducing RSA, RCG, barista and first aid courses. How's that going to be funded?
Sure. I think the way that practically it would happen would be perhaps once a weekend every semester. It would be kind of a capped amount of applications or sign-ups to those courses. I think that at the surplus the union is running at, and based on the obvious information that the USU is regaining quite steadily after the introduction of VSU, that there is room for expansion in its programs and in the services it offers, and also by virtue of the fact that we'll be booking huge group bookings, the discounts would also help make that more affordable.
Just to follow up on that, I guess I agree, obviously there'll be a discount for a group price, but each of the courses runs at roughly $100 each. First aid's actually more like $200. Even if we're talking like an 80% discount, we might be talking somewhere between $20 and $80 worth of courses per student. So how many students do you think you would be able to, say, have it one weekend a semester and cap it? How many students do you imagine you might be able to include in that sort of program?
Again, I don't have the specifics of the finances in that scenario, but I hope to be able to offer it to, as many people as possible. But I think even considering a couple of hundred, I think that's particularly doable. Yeah.
Okay, great.
How's your breakfast bar policy going to work, and is it going to be the same or different to other candidates that also have that policy?
Sure. I think it's funny that 3 or 4 candidates this year are running on a breakfast bar policy. I think it's indicative that it's just genuinely a good idea. In terms of how it would work, I think it would work in much the same way as the USU runs it during O Week, which is just, it's portable, which I think is also a great thing about the potential of that policy. It's, one day you can be at PNR, one day you can be at Bosch, the next day you can be on Eastern Avenue, to make sure that, every student, regardless of where you are on campus, can have access to it. Do you have any more specific questions about how it would work? As in, if it's financially feasible, is that?
Well, that, and also I noticed on your policy platform that it would draw inspiration from the UTS
Yes.
program. Will it be exactly the same as the UTS program?
Sure. I think the UTS program is really great in its level of sustainability. Also its affordability. I mean, it costs UTS $40,000 a year, which again, given the surplus of 2012, I think that makes it particularly doable.
Okay. So on the note of your pre-exam pick-me-up policy,
yeah.
Just specifically about energy drinks,
Sure.
Is there any evidence, as in non-anecdotal evidence, that energy drinks are useful for study or for exam performance? And if not, why do you think the USU should be promoting their consumption, when to do so would be to promote an unhealthy lifestyle among young people?
Sure. I think that realistically, a lot of those students, if they weren't being handed a free energy drink, they'd probably buy an energy drink anyway. In terms of its correlation to study effectiveness, I mean, it seems to be a lot of people's study drink of choice. That said, if I got, overwhelming scientific knowledge to the contrary, I would not hand out energy drinks and hand out, water instead.
Okay. I guess just a comment on that is not so much that people would buy the energy drinks themselves. There's obviously a difference between students doing that and the USU, I guess, promoting it by
Sure.
saying, here's an energy drink. And in terms of what you say about receiving evidence to the contrary, is it your position that you need to receive evidence to say that it's bad rather than look for evidence to say that it's good?
No, I definitely don't think so. I think that the USU should really research and things like that. If I'm going to be frank, using the term energy drink in my policy statement was probably just more of a throwaway. Not necessarily catch-all, but just, handing out a free snack or beverage.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, I'd swap it out for coffee, Yeah.
What are the pragmatic aspects of the pre-exam pick-me-up system? You say in your policy statement, it can be used for, quote, if you don't want to give up your seat in the library,
Mm-hmm.
end quote. Will people walk through the library distributing free food?
Sure. I imagine it could work like that, yeah. Or if not, pick up a muesli bar on your way in. On the not wanting to give up your seat thing, I mean, I know that a lot of people I know go without food because they don't want to give up their seat in Fisher because it's just so dire at times of stress. So if people were able to do it quietly and hand out their muesli bars, I'd be really happy.
I suppose that's the question. It seems as though it might be a bit distracting.
Sure.
Have you considered that?
I feel like 30 seconds of distraction of someone walking by you to hand you a muesli bar when that's probably going to be better for your nutrition and overall your study capacity, then that's a worthwhile distraction.
Okay. So next policy question is, do you have an actual quota for the free night event quota policy?
Sure. I would hope that it could be, half or more. I don't know whether that is a particularly practical or particularly realistic, but at this point, I believe that the the amount of free nighttime events is 20% or under. I would love to see that at least double.
And when you say free, does that mean the whole night will be free, or just the event and you have to pay for food and drink?
I would hope the whole event.
Okay. And how affordable do you think that would be if you've got, one event a week that might, particularly with Manning, which has got a capacity of several hundred,
Sure.
or 1,000, I think it is.
Sure.
How affordable do you think that is?
I think it would be particularly affordable if we reconsidered the way that we are able to fund clubs and societies events, because I imagine that in my vision of that policy, clubs and societies events are considered under that as well. At the moment, the way that clubs and societies, as I'm sure you all know, is based on the differential pricing between an access and a non-access card holder. I think that removing that requirement of having a differential pricing and just being able to, you know, get a reimbursement for an amount of money you spend, rather than based on an arbitrary ticket pricing system, would be a way to make it more affordable.
So is that to suggest that if, you know, an access card holder gets into an event, a club or society event for free, and a non-access card holder has to pay $5 or something, are you suggesting then that to get rid of that differential pricing would mean that non-access members would be able to go in for free as well?
I think that that's a different issue altogether, but I think that night events being free on campus and being able to encompass people that aren't sucked into the union's programs is a really important thing as well. I think that has corollary benefits like campus at night, just, you know, being safer, for example. So I think that as an end goal, that's a really great way for it to end up.
When you say that it will be safer, that obviously talks about there being more people around.
Yeah.
Do you think there would be any issues around, you know, for example, the consumption of alcohol, nighttime, the amount of security not necessarily being increased to accommodate for the number of people that might be on campus, unless that's also part of your policy? Do you think that, I mean, I guess I'm interested to know on what basis you think it will be.
It'll be safer?
Yeah.
Sure. I think there's a whole lot of conversations that can be had about how we can make campus at night safer. I think one of those things is just having more people around, because you know, empty spaces can, you know, just naturally be more dangerous. That said, I'd be really happy to support things like dry event quotas, for example, things like having more campus security, having alarm buttons and things. What are they? Panic buttons?
Distress.
Yeah, distress call buttons and things like that. I think there's, you know, a whole lot of things that can be done, you know, in conjunction with that policy.
So the union in the past has had some difficulties and some problems with free parties reaching capacity.
Sure.
With parties in general reaching capacity. If they're free, this problem will be exacerbated. Have you considered that?
So based on the correlation between free parties and them being cheaper, being more full, or less full?
Yeah,
more full.
More full.
So the O-Week party, for example, is typically incredibly over-attended.
Yeah.
I know that people this year were queuing outside for, you know, 1 or 2 hours because it reached capacity by about 7:45.
Yeah.
So do you think that that would be an issue in terms of free events?
And people just not getting in? I think that if there are more free events and they are more frequent, then people are less likely to go to all of them, and they're more likely to, you know, pick and choose, and therefore that'll be okay, and it'll distribute, you know, pretty evenly. I think O-Week's a little bit different because there's just the O-Week rush.
Yeah. Okay, sure. So the next question is about the Access Sydney Art Scene policy. Basically, how does it work? And more specifically, would it work in a similar way to the way Access partners currently work with the union? I presume you know how that is, but if you want to...
Yeah, of course. I think it would work in largely the same way, thinking about how we have a partnership with, for example, Hoyt's Broadway, things like that. It would just be that, you know, there would be a discount provided for by those, you know, museums and galleries and things like that.
So basically encouraging places like the Enmore, places like the Metro art galleries to essentially sign up to a similar program to what the Access partners do.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And given that they're currently not involved in Access programs, been around for a while, do you think that there's a reason for that? Do you think that there needs to be specific lobby work done, I guess, towards those organisations?
I think it's just what the priorities have been and what the directions have been of previous boards. It seems to have been that, you know, people's priorities on off-campus partnerships in the past have been largely food and drink based. I think that's fine, and I think they've got a really solid program of that. I believe that they are looking at things like online partnerships with things like ASOS. I think they're also really great. I think this is just, again, a different direction to move in.
In regards to your marketplace policy, you've kind of sold that as being an alternative to the expense of setting up at other places, the time-consuming nature of it, and you promote it as being a really easy way to sell students the things they want to sell. Will it cost to have a stall though?
I would hope not.
Okay. And I mean, in terms of what the people that currently have market stalls do at the moment. They're normally turning up with a big van full of a tent and tables and racks full of merchandise. Do you think the union, I mean, as part of your policy to get the union to provide things like tents or tables, things like that? Because otherwise it seems like there might be some difficulty in terms of competition, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be really happy for the union to provide those kind of things.
Okay. It's largely accepted that the main voting populace will be arts students, commerce students, law students. How are you going to engage other students on other campuses? Do you have any policies that will target places like the conservatorium or other campuses? Sure.
Things like the breakfast bar, I think, are really easy to do on all campuses, given that, you know, there are catering outlets on all of the satellite campuses. I also think that's particularly attractive to just any student, not particular or pertinent to, you know, what degree they're doing. I think that the arts scene policy is really, really cool for the satellite campuses, because places like the Con and places like SCA are probably more naturally inclined to want to go to things like that. And so, yeah, that'd be a really cool thing for them.
I suppose, are you going to have a voting presence at those other campuses so that they know that these things are viable?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, I've got friends at those campuses that are, you know, currently wearing my shirt.
Cool.
So the last question is, in a recent letter to the Bull, it was pointed out that all of last year's board directors have failed on at least one election promise. What will you do to convince voters that your policies are not empty promises?
On the basis that they are financially feasible, they are not so inconsistent with what the board's direction has been in previous years and what it seems to, you know, be going down the path of.
And if elected, how would you remain accountable, I suppose, to the students that elect you?
Sure. I think I'd be really happy to encourage things like board director, you know, a tracking scheme, as kind of creepy as that sounds, in something like Bull, you know, using union publications and union using the union blog posts, for example, to, you know, update and things like that. I also think that the member forums that occur are really, really important. That said, I think that there's an issue in the way that the union advertises them, for example, because the people that attend them are hacks, essentially.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that point, I'm not sure if they're called promises by you, but it seems as though pretty much every candidate, elected candidate in the past, hasn't met every criteria that they've campaigned on. So are you willing to say that you might not meet some of your criteria?
Sure. I think it would be pretty blindsided of anyone to say that they will absolutely definitely achieve things in a 2-year period, because whilst it is a very short amount of time to be able to achieve things, it also is a really long time in terms of like the board being able to make quite radical strategic decisions in the complete other direction that you made a policy in line with. So I mean, I'm not going to absolutely promise that by, you know, the 30th of June 2016 I will have delivered those 5 things, but I'd really hope I did.
Do you have any type of hierarchy in your promises? Is one thing more important than the others?
I think that my policies all address, and to me it's really important that they addressed what I perceive to be holes in what the union does in how it conceives of students' well-being and things like that. So I think my hierarchy would be to make sure that in some way I had addressed each of those problems rather than looking at the policies themselves, if that makes sense. Great.
Okay, thanks very much.
Cool, thanks guys. Whew. It's really warm.
It's so hot.
It is.
It's so hot.
I was like,
I've had like 4